Hi, everybody. I'm Ria. I'm a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Oxford, and my background is in applied math and physics. The discussion that I would like to initiate today is on how whole brain emulation could be useful to solve some inherent challenges in AI alignment, and how specifically evolutionary theory can shed light on the mechanism of value drift. So most of you are probably familiar with the alignment problem. It basically seeks to answer the question of how can we make sure that AI systems act in a way that is beneficial for humanity? And I think it can be split into three main questions. How do we specify the values that an AI system should have from the outset? How do we verify that those values, that it has the correct values? And how do we make sure that it maintains values that are aligned with human values over time? So, depending on how you define a successful emulation, I think that a criterion is that it will have the same values as, at least in the beginning, as the biological human. And it is important to think about how values change over time, because AI systems will be running at much higher speeds, which means that centuries of their time will correspond to just minutes or seconds of our time, during which the values can change radically. So because of the definition of a successful emulation, we narrow down the three problems of AI alignment to two. We don't have the problem of specifying the initial values. And the question that I would like to focus on is, how do we think about value drift in emulations? And I think a useful approach that we can take is think about evolutionary theory and what lessons we can learn from evolutionary theory about how values change over time and how structure changes over time. What's the mechanism of that? And I want to first introduce two main concepts from evolutionary theory, the notion of natural selection and the notion of a replicator. So natural selection is the process by which entities best suited to the environment are more likely to survive. And I specifically chose a very broad term for that, a very broad definition. And a replicator is any entity that passes on its structure largely unchanged through successive generations. So this leads to three questions. Which entities are subject to natural selection? Who benefits long-term from the selection? And who adapts as a result of natural selection? And I first turn to the first question. So there are two main views on the first question. The fact that a unit of selection is any entity that transfers some material matter to future generations. And another definition is that it's any entity that passes on its structure directly through replication, but it doesn't require any material overlap, only the copying of certain properties. And I specifically adopt the second view, which aligns with a statistical interpretation of natural selection, which says that evolution is just a statistical phenomenon. Simply, the fittest traits are the ones that increase in frequency over time. There's no unit that nature intrinsically favors. That means that everything is a replicator. And now we turn to the second question: who is the beneficiary? Who benefits long-term from selection? And we can think of someone benefiting because of their fitness, which makes them a primary beneficiary, and someone benefiting from other entities' fitness, which makes them secondary beneficiaries. And then we may ask, what properties should an entity have for it to increase its fitness? And I have listed some properties that I think are very important, such as how many strategies can you adopt to survive, whether you can adapt and how well you can adapt to the environment, how easy it is for you to remain alive, to not die, what strategies do other entities employ in order to survive, and are those orthogonal to your survival, or do they affect your survival? And how complex of an organism are you? So simpler organisms or simpler entities, such as a gene, are easier to survive than an entire human, until we get cloning at least. So we see more gene replication than replication of entire humans in nature. And how can we apply this way of thinking to EMS? So we can think of what strategies are EMS likely to employ, and these include incentives for copying themselves, incentives for self-sacrificing, incentives for cooperating with humans, and how do certain incentives that they have benefit humans as secondary beneficiaries. And by thinking about these questions, we realize that adaptation of behavior and hence value drift are very much dependent on the environment. The good news is that we can shape that environment. So it's very useful to think about what specific environment we should enforce or incentivize such that it's beneficial to humanity. Some questions to think about is which strategies does the environment support? What kind of environment fosters cooperation, dimensions of and variance in diversity, and some further questions. And I think that's it.
Oh, okay, great. Time. Questions, comments, thoughts? Value drift early morning?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, maybe I missed the beginning. Are there a lot of people working? It's blowing my mind that this value drift. I didn't even think about it, but are there a lot of people working in this field? Is it
specifically using evolutionary theory to think about value drift?
Yeah, sorry.
There are a few books and papers on it. So, for example, Robin Hansen's book on emulations just discussed that in a more general sense, and there are some specific papers that do talk about how the environment shapes value drift, but it's not very rigorous because it's also very difficult to make it very rigorous due to complexity.
How do you even start trying to do this? Like, it seems like it's a difficult, like how do you influence the environment, and also how do you know what effect that will have, is my question.
One thing that I would be very interested in is actually looking at history and trying to find parameters in the environment and seeing how those parameters shape the environment, and sort of using a more mathematical approach to identifying certain variables that shape the environment, and then looking at different times in history what the environment looked like, what was those parameters in that environment, and what incentives did that promote.
Well, thank you so much. Anyone else? Questions, comments?
This one right there.
Project. Good. All right. Okay. Great. I was asking, to what extent do you think it will be necessary or advisable to recapitulate some of the fundamental contingencies of living organisms, like the need to defy entropy and maintain oneself over time and avoid harm and things, to make these isomorphisms with evolution and its contingencies valid?
I think that most organisms, for example, don't, and that's why I mentioned that statistical interpretation. I think most organisms don't necessarily think about their survival. It's just simply that the ones that adapt to the environment best are the ones that tend to survive. Obviously, those have certain characteristics. So those characteristics tend to increase in frequency over time. So I think it's very important to sort of think about it from that perspective. For example, there are people that there is a view called genic selectionism, which says, for example, that nature really favors gene reproduction. So in that view, you can say that we don't need to worry about this too much. Nature favors gene reproduction. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. But, yeah.
Can I persist? Is that right? Or just pass Well, for example, like implicit in what you're saying is for example, that agents die, that agents like at some point discontinue, or that agents reproduce, and that's not necessarily an assumption one has to make in agents that one might build. So that's the question of like, to what extent do you have to include the capacity to die and the need to reproduce and maintain itself for these assumptions about applying evolutionary analogs to work?
I don't
Which I think they might, by the way. I think vulnerability is necessary for alignment, but.
I don't think you do, and also how you define death might be a bit tricky when it comes to non-living systems. So, for example,
Right.
if you think of a rock changes its shape over time, but also humans tend to choose certain rocks, for example, or if you think of rocks existing in the environment, there are certain environmental factors that affect how a rock changes over time. And then certain types of rocks, or even certain shapes of rocks, are more frequent in the environment due to that. So I don't think that reproduction itself plays a major role. If you think of, you can also think of mimic selection, for example, where it's about humans choosing which specific pieces of information will be passed down over time.
We'll leave it at this. Lots to discuss in the breakouts, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.